Well, I just want to welcome you, and it's very exciting that you're here. I'm going to read your bio as an introduction. Jay Simple is a visual artist from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, yay! And currently resides in Pamplin, Virginia. He is a visiting assistant professor of photography at Longwood University and founder of the Photographer's Green Book, a resource for inclusion, equity, and diversity within the photographic medium. Working through photography, video, sculpture, performance, and large-scale installations, Simple examines historical and contemporary effects of colonialism and white supremacy within the context of the United States. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Photography from Columbia College of Chicago, a Master of Liberal Art from University of Pennsylvania, and a Master of Fine Arts in Photography from the Rhode Island School of Design. He has had recent solo exhibitions at Hampton. Is that how you say it? Hampton?
Hampton, yeah.
Hampton, Sydney College, Longwood University, and group exhibitions at Franklin Street Works, Longwood Center for Visual Arts, and Jamestown Arts Center and Clamp Art in New York. Welcome, Jay. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate everyone joining. Though I'm over here in Virginia, it's kind of nice. I feel like I'm back home right now in the good city of Philadelphia. So today I want to talk to you all a little bit about my work. I have to say, admittedly, that I think in this moment, it always feels strange to talk about your work, perhaps, with all these other sort of things going on around us. There's like this feeling of like self-indulgence that doesn't seem like maybe attuned to the cultural and social moment that we're going to. And so today I'm going to talk about my work, but kind of in a roundabout way of really trying to take some time and like meditate on some topics that have come up, I think, for a lot of us, and sort of connecting those with my work and sort of trying to think about that a little bit. So this is a different way of showing my work than I had in the past. So I'm kind of excited for it. All right, let's see if I can do this correctly. Is that good? Everyone can see that? We're all on the same page.
Yes.
Cool. All right. So I started, when I was starting to write this, I kind of always write or like kind of put together my lectures or just whatever to music. So the title for this one came from a Bob Marley song, Exodus. And one of the lines from it is, who trod through great tribulation, and it just felt fitting for, I think, probably this moment. But as I sort of get into it and start talking about it, I think it's many moments through history we have seen great tribulation, and sort of the history or the narrative that comes from those are often the narratives of those who have trod through great tribulation to the moment that we're in today. In thinking about this, you know, I will talk a lot about ideas of colonialism and white supremacy that sort of runs throughout a lot of my projects. And a lot of those things I've been doing for quite a while, often as sort of before I was really kind of making this work. I worked as a filmmaker, mostly as a cinematographer and a producer for documentary films, and a lot of those actually having connections to Philadelphia. So one of those being, I worked on a project called Reach Ambler, which was about Ambler, Pennsylvania. Me and one of my colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania, Matthew Tarditi, we worked on this project for about 4 or 5 years, documenting the effects of asbestos in rural Pennsylvania, which is very much different than some of the things that I'm working on right now. But again, it was like one of these instances early on in my career, this is like 2011-ish that this started, was centered around looking at the effects of industrialism and all these sort of things, which also, again, sort of tie into colonialism and the ways in which we set up operations of commerce as well as like political structures. I also, over the past about 10 years, I've been working with my father, and we've been making documentary films on the continent of Africa, really looking at the effects of colonialism and white supremacy on the African continent in terms of, decolonizing those spaces, and also sort of like freedom struggles and all these sort of topics. Most recently, I helped produce a series of films that were a part of the remake of the University of Pennsylvania's Africa Galleries. And it's a series of films where we go across Africa looking at the effects of colonialism and the stealing of African cultural material in these spaces and being put into museums around the world. And I think we see this conversation happening in a lot of art spaces about what should happen to these objects. And so as this guy says, you know, what belongs to Africa should be returned back to Africa. And so it's about varying degrees of these sort of topics, right? And so as I'm talking, I'll be talking a lot about things that are personal to me, my experiences with certain systems, right? But I want to always keep in mind that they are not very much always centered on my own experience, but that dealing with colonialism and the effects of that are widespread. They aren't just within the United States, but they have global implications as well. And so even though when you look at this work, you know, often I think when I hear or see things that are written about my photos, often the pretext of it being about Black experience is both true, but also limiting in the effects of the way that people think about it. And so I want to make sure that we think about the work in global ways, but also personal ways to ourselves so that you don't get stuck in the trope of colonialism and white supremacy, which tells you that the color of my skin has a basis for the ability to what I say or give have some value directly to your own experience. So I put this slideshow together looking at 3 bodies of work, and they're kind of haphazardly, not haphazardly, but they're kind of mixed together. It's not in the normal kind of chronological order, which is kind of fun because, again, it talks about history in different aspects. So The Ties That Bind Us is looking at more proper colonialism and thinking about colonial America, enslavement, emancipation, Civil War, Revolutionary War, in that period. Whites Only really looks at the civil rights movement and some of the struggles that came out of that. And more recently, I'm working on a body of work called Exodus Home, which is looking at talking about the Great Migration and thinking about what does it mean to call a place home, and how do you come to terms with the histories and things that rest within the structures that you inhabit. So when I'm kind of thinking about these issues, this sort of like analogy of like the chicken or the egg and like which one comes first constantly comes to mind. And I think about that in the ways in which we like focus on one aspect or another to try to find solutions to issues. So I think right now I'm noticing a lot of like hypervisuality or hyper sort of looking at Blackness and what that means in the Black experience. And, you know, rightfully so, you know, you see Black Lives Matter and all these, you know, issues that are coming to a more upfront way. But I kind of, we'll get into this trying to dissect what exactly that, what that visualizing and hypervisualization does and doesn't do. And I think also simultaneously, right, we also think about looking at whiteness and sort of these structures and colonialism and these type of things and trying to figure out exactly how those things operate as well is an important thing that I think is often put on the back burner a little ways. And I'm kind of pushing for this idea that we can't only look at the experience of the oppressed to be able to understand how we get to moments of progress, but we have to also really dive down into the ideology of the oppressor to understand exactly the actions that are being taken upon the person in different ways, right? So in my work, I kind of balance back and forth between this. I look at myself, right, and my experiences with colonialism and white supremacy and these sort of systems. But then simultaneously, I'm also focusing on those systems and trying to critique, dissect, and where I can disrupt them. So obviously, you know, when I thought of that analogy, I don't know if it directly fits, but I thought about like, I was thinking about the egg, right? And I was thinking about youth and growing up and being a child and thinking of really about how being Black, very often in this country, you grow up very fast. You understand brutality and the struggle before you even can really spell out the words, before you can even fully emote what's happening before you. So this photograph is actually just me and my daughter. We went to these like Civil War museums in Atlanta. And just this vision, like this image of her looking at these bombs and stuff was just like, it was gut wrenching in a way, even though the moment wasn't. I think she was just playing around and having fun, but just thinking about that symbolic moment of having to be so young and look around, especially if you think about being young and looking around now, right? Seeing so much violence that's done to people that look like you, right? And so, from that, we kind of talk about these ideas of like generational trauma, right? Like generations of growing up, having seen these things and experience it and how it connects to the past. And often, right, I think when you think about generational trauma, sometimes it's like this romantic thing that like, the ancestors are surging through your veins and speaking to you, and that's how you come to it. And I think that's too romantic of an idea. I think of it a little bit more rationally. I don't know if that's even fair, because I think I even have my own moments where it's not that rational feeling, where I can hear things and I feel like these things speaking to me about who I am and what I am. So one of those moments just happened recently when I was looking at Beyonce's Black is King. If you haven't seen it, after this, definitely go look at it. It's a great film, but it's one of those moments and one of those films that kind of had that resonance to me, where I looked at it and I could have this kind of emotional feeling about my experiences of being Black. I also thought it was interesting in this moment because it was so positive, right? And it was like, there was so much like love and joy in it. And I think, while I'll talk about some very painful things within this, we can't only relegate the Black experiences to things of struggle and pain, but we have to think about them a little bit more holistically. And so when I think about how I find these sort of my ancestors speaking to me through the generations, I find it in, the written, the spoken, the filmed archives that we have all over around us, right? And so in this piece right here is a sculpture I made. So I work in photography, I make sculptures, I kind of bounce around based off of basically how I felt that day in the studio. I'll kind of try anything really. And so I made this sculpture that's made out of this antique school bus, and on it is printed the court documents and evidence for Davis versus the Board of Education, County School Board of Prince Edward County. Prince Edward County is where Farmville is located. Farmville is where I live. So it's Farmville, Virginia. It's in Southern Virginia, a small town. But what's interesting about it is that it was a part of the Brown versus Board of Education. There we go. So it was one of the cases that was underneath all of that, right? And so after, of course, it was ruled that it was illegal to be segregated, the school board here decided to close all the schools for 5 years instead of desegregate, right? And so you have a generation of people who are denied access to education, right? And their sort of desire to achieve and do the things that they dream about, right? So the bus seat becomes this hazardous space, right? And so when I think about generational trauma, right, I think about how you can look back at history, and then you can start to tie it to moments and things that are happening right now, right? And so I think about the calls for more diversity and inclusion within our education system right now, which is happening heavily within the arts. So this is one such call that came out of RISD, where I got my graduate degree at, right? And so I had my own experiences and understand exactly, what this means for that place. But also, it's not necessarily just about this one university, right? It's about all these sort of general spaces that follow certain ways of thinking and doing things, right? And so when I think about generational trauma, I think about it in the sense of being able to look at this call and then simultaneously think back to something like Davis versus, the Board of Education, where they're fighting for the ability to learn in a safe space. And right now, there's still people fighting for that same thing And so you have people who through generations, right, can see how a certain level of trauma or oppression is constantly put upon them. But then, right, going back to the chicken, the egg thing, right? So the egg, right, it's blackness. But thinking about looking at the chicken as well, right? And what does that mean to be white? And what are the things that you learn? And I think about how it is sometimes very much ingrained in ideas of brutality, to be naive, curious, and ironic, sometimes all at the same time. So this is an image at a museum in Salem, looking at Bloody Sunday, which was the march from Salem to Montgomery that happened, and the police, brutalized protesters looking to, do all the things of the civil rights movement. And so this moment was really strange. It's not staged or anything. I was just actually going inside to take photographs of this diorama. And so the diorama is of these officers in front of this Black family, and you see the Edmund Pettus Bridge. If you don't know, Edmund Pettus was the Grand Wizard, so the leader of the Alabama KKK, and also a senator, right? And so in this moment, in that section, right, in that little moment, there's these kids and they're playing tag. And I'm still taking, I was there when the family came, and I was just like, okay, well, I guess we're taking photos. And the girl stops and starts to play with the Black girl's hair, right? And if you don't know, that's a gesture of like, that holds a lot of connotations to it, of like difference of the idea of Black hair. It's charged within this country. I mean, to the point, right, where you have people being expelled from school for dreads and all these other type of things, right? And so thinking about the naiveness of that gesture in that moment, in that space, again, culminating all that history and the present moment, becomes sort of a powerful statement about how a white child may grow within this world. But then also it's important to notice, I think, that whiteness is both performative and regenerative in the same way that it deceives and destroys, right? And how do I mean this? Is to look at this picture for example. So I took this photograph of a George Washington reenactor, and he's reenacting before George Washington crosses the Delaware River in 1776, which was like this decisive moment in the Revolutionary War, right? So much that they have this commemorative sort of celebration at this point where they were supposed to cross. And this moment, if we think about it in a historical context, right, was brought to pass by the bravery, action, and leadership of a brutal tyrant who enslaved hundreds of human beings to whom he treated like cattle to be sent to the slaughter, right? So we know that George Washington owned a large amount of slaves, right? But then simultaneously was talking about freedom and liberty, right? And in the photo, right, he's being filmed by a news crew who broadcast this celebration as a noteworthy moment to celebrate white men stealing Native American land, right? So you see that it's both performative in the way that George is performing this guy, it's regenerative in the way that the newscasters, propagate this idea. In the same way that, right, it deceives and destroys, right? So it tells you that this is a good guy, and it destroys they destroy by the ways in which they enact their brutality into the world. Now, which makes me think about it is that, if Black people have this generational trauma, then white people very often have been allowed to have generational delusion about what they can do and what they can't do within this world, which warps senses of reality and perception. And so what happens often for people who are oppressed and those who oppress, when they are put into a space together, there is a lot of tension that can occur in the most mundane of places. And I thought about this when making this image, and it's a picture that I made during my graduate studies at Rhode Island, and it's in front of this apartment complex that's named the Plantations, right? And in it, I was just thinking about like having this scene that was totally uncharged, right? Like we're in front of this space, there's some groceries on the ground, they're falling out of a bag. I'm picking those groceries up. And there's a guy sort of standing over me in a way, right? And I think within it itself, it's like a normal moment. But if you're attuned to some of the ideologies that I'm talking about, right? Can you imagine like me sitting there as hyper aware as I am, right? Thinking about, I'm at this place called the Plantations, picking vegetables off the ground. This guy is standing over me, has some very interesting mental images that come up, again, thinking about through time of what happened at places that were called plantations. And so I find myself within these systems, right, of looking at history, understanding my space in it, thinking about often really about the incompleteness of the archive or of the things that we learn and hear. Like a lot of, Black history isn't recorded in the Western way, right? A lot of things slip through the cracks. We can think about that in terms of photography itself, right? You think back to early photographers, you don't really hear that, photography was created during the last, years of enslavement, right? And so you had Black photographers who were freemen who created images which aren't even, accessible anymore because they weren't archived, they weren't seen as valuable, but they were a way of thinking about photography. And I think it's very interesting to think about that. This is a side tangent, but I was thinking the other day, like when we think about and talk about photography, very often we talk about its harmful effects and the ways that we need to not do harmful things. And we understand that based off of the history of photography and the things that early photographers have done. And I just wonder what happens if we recentered our minds or our thought process of the history of photography around other people who used it as a liberating tool for the causes that they saw important for themselves, their lives, and other people around them. So as I'm looking at this archive and its incompleteness, I'm constantly also trying to mess with it a little bit. So this was a white power newspaper that I found that was from 1972. And I removed certain text to rework the way in which it read. So it reads, "White power is genocide. Whites wake up, stop the murder, or you'll be next to burn," right? And so again, taking the archive and reworking it so that it can work for my benefit to be able to say the messages that I want to be able to say, right? And very often you find that scholars and people looking at history have to do this. They have to rework what's there to be able to tell the narrative that is not there yet. We're doing all right?
Yes, it's going well. Thank you.
Need a little drink there. So I feel like all of that, I say all of that, right? Just to say like that's my mindset, right? That's like where I woke up this morning, right? Like I was thinking about these issues in that sort of term, in those sort of complex ways, right? And it really made me think about this picture because it's like we're all headed somewhere, right? Like we're all headed down this path together, right? This metaphorical path, right? As a country, as a nation, as a world, however you want to think about it, we're all headed down this path together. And it seems that there's like a bipolarness to like opinions, right? And we're all headed to this place that's very clear that whatever place we arrive at, this lynching station, someone who was going there, we went there together, someone's not going to be able to make it out of that space, right? And so thinking about that, I realized that, it's been very much a necessity to enter this work that I make. I think just life generally, you kind of have to like pull together like a tool set, right? To be able to navigate this journey and to ensure your survival at the end, right? And so I was thinking about this tool set the other day. I was in my house like, right now, and this is an image that's a part of Exodus Home, right? So the tool set's a suitcase, all right? We'll smudge the analogy there, all right? But I was thinking about what would I pack on my travels, right? And so I thought, well, if I packed my stuff away, I'd have to pack it in the bag that was always been handed down to me. Like this bag has seen so much stuff. And so through this project, I pull a lot of objects outside of from older homes. So in this project, Exodus Home, I'm going around Virginia shooting spaces that were inhabited during or before the Great Migration. And within a lot of these homes, you'll still find objects from the people who lived there. And so this suitcase came from one of those homes. And so I was thinking about all the things that I would pack up and that I'd need, right? And I was thinking, well, I would need things to build, right? So I need a hammer, I need to build some things. I need to be able to build with people. And I thought about, Martin Luther King. He's a good middle liner in being able to pull people from different aspects of life, right? And so having those skills of negotiation, I would have to have a different type of hammer. I would have to be able to operate and use the weaponry of the colonizer, which has always been the gun. I think that a lot of people who think about and make theory centering around the struggle for freedom against systems like we see here in the United States, we often talk about we are in very much a militaristic sort of ideology, right? And so can you fight that system without having to use some levels of violence, right? And so again, I think there's some type of tension between that Martin Luther King image, right, and the gun as well. But I think that, again, thinking about having the proper tool set, right, it's not about, for me, the way there. It's about the eventual place that we're going to end up at and being prepared for the things you'll have to do there. I'll need things to barter with, right? Got to use the money, right? The things that have value here. Again, thinking about the complexity between sort of what we think of the United States and what we think of the Confederacy. Very much right now in our politics, we're seeing that the Confederacy and those ideologies are very much still alive, right? So the stamp on the bill becomes easily replaceable from the image that's normally there. And I got to bring the things to distract me, the libations to give. So I got to bring a bottle of, I got to bring the Hennessy, you guys. All right, I'm sorry. I had a lot of fun writing this, you guys. I chuckled a lot. All right, you gotta laugh through the pain sometimes, right? But also to move through these spaces to make that travel, right? To do this sort of work that we talk about in terms of change. There's this tricky thing that happens where you have to be stealthily. You have to sort of camouflage yourself in a way to try to bring down these structures. If they know that you're there, it seems like they try to fall on top of you or try to consume you in a way, right? And I've been thinking about this idea of consumption, right? And this kind of goes back to like the hypervisual nature of Blackness and sort of violence against Black bodies that becomes normalized in a way. And I noticed that consumption, like, or that falling down isn't to like kill you, but it's like to hold you where you are. Maybe it's to placate you, but it's to make sure that like, oh, we know that you're trying to get somewhere. We're going to hold you exactly where you are. And we're going to maybe give you small things. And we'll talk about that. But I thought about that holding and that sort of consumption in a way. So this was an image I took in Williamsburg, Virginia at Colonial Williamsburg. How I explain it, it is the Disneyland of colonial America, right? Which is like kind of horrifying if you think about Mickey Mouse as like George Washington, right? But it's a whole place just like that you can go to. And that's not to say that everything is bad there. I know a lot of the people who are reenactors there, and there's a lot of great things that they do to try to tell the narrative of a more robust narrative of American history. I give them credit for that, right? But it was interesting that the only like historical thing that you could really like interact with there is the stocks, right? And the stocks are basically what they used to put like criminals or enslaved people into to torture them. And so it's this like gag image that people make where they put themselves in the stocks and they take pictures of it, right? I mean, it's just a thing that happens. It's like when I see it, it disturbs me, but when everyone else is like, it's not a charged moment for whatever reason, right? And so there was this moment that I was photographing, and it's this Black family. They're putting their kids inside the stocks to take the image of it. And you see this white couple, two people on the left, and they come from probably the left corner of the frame. They actually jogging like a brisk walk at best. And they're screaming, "Oh my God, like, do you see this? I can't believe this is happening." And they come up and they just start taking pictures. And they're just like, "This is great. Like, wow, this is so wonderful." And so it made me again think about this consumption of violence, right? Or oppression on the Black body that becomes a norm for how people even engage with the Black body, that becomes normalized to the point that this couple thought that that was an acceptable or okay moment to go out and take photographs and to exclaim about how wonderful it was. But this consumption thing, it doesn't only happen in sort of this more physical act of violence, but you can also think about it in sort of like cultural terms, right? So thinking about the arts and consumption. You know, right now it seems everyone wants to talk to a Black artist all of a sudden and to hear their voices. And so I know from my own experience and talking to a lot of other artists, right, they're getting calls and hearing from big magazines and stuff like that who want them to shoot things for them, who ignore their voices all the time, right? Have ignored their voices all into this, this movement that really got sparked by George Floyd and everything that happened, right? And so we get to this moment where it's like that consumption where they want to see the work, they want to see the things, but is that actually the support, right? Has something changed? It's a troubling moment for many people to think through, right? Because think at a moment where people all of a sudden are saying your voice is so important, right? And that's what they're telling, we really want to hear it, and it's the voice of right now, and we want to hear the things that you have to say, right? Because the world needs to know these. But then simultaneously in that person's life, they're realizing that they can be killed on the street with little repercussion, right? And that puts a lot of people, artists, right? And not just artists, right? Just most people who are out in this world, right? In this weird space, right? This weird space where you kind of feel like you're locked in, but maybe you're not. Like, it's like looking at this door and trying to figure out if it's locked or if it's open, right? And it's like living in that constant flux of a moment where you can be free, running free out into the world to do the things that you may want or need to do, right? Having the opportunity to go places that you probably weren't going to get those opportunities before, locked behind that door. But simultaneously, you're kind of stuck and smothered in a way, right? And you're unsure of the certainty of being able to even breathe for another moment. So you're kind of gasping for air. And you live in that flux. And it creates, I can say personally, a level of discomfort, but you start to feel really kind of boxed in. And you feel like people are trying to put you in certain boxes when it's appropriate for them. This is the image from the archive here at Longwood University. They have a really good collection of archival images going back to the 40s or the 50s. I saw a lot of, and just the university has done a good job at tracking itself, which is very interesting to look at sort of some of the ways that it has looked at race and equality in the past. But this image comes from it, and it was called Sunshine and Shadow. That's what the tag that they had originally taken it. And this was back in the 50s, right? And so I was thinking about how sort of making the shadow box where, shadow lives inside of. And that is a space that often people try to relegate us in. And it's wrapped in this burlap, which is used on, in the agricultural world, right? And so really we're we're shrouded in the shadow of our own labor, and in this like weird way where people want to box us in with the things that we do, right? So just like the way, for example, I can go make work and it's always Black work. Like when people talk about my work, sometimes it's I'm a Black photographer, right? You go talk and they look at a white photographer and that person is just a photographer, right? So we get put in these sort of boxes, which are, in a way, they kind of dehumanize, and they make the person, a shadow of what you really are, right? You become a shadow of levels of oppression. You become a shadow of levels of violence against your own self, because again, there's this hyper visualization of these levels of oppression and violence against the Black body. And this is taken in Rhode Island, on what used to be the plantation for Moses Brown, of the Brown family, Brown University. There's an interesting article that just came out about that. I won't digress into it, but it was taken on there, and it's just interesting. That moment to me was like walking around the neighborhood, and it was just like super nice houses, right? But like that history still is there, but it's kind of been shrouded, and there hasn't been any like conversation about it, right? And this is sort of like this level of erasure that can happen when we start to sort of tokenize or box away people's ability to tell their narrative and their story. I hate snakes. I hate snakes. I'm from Philly, as you guys know. I live in the country now. I live like there's cows next door to me. There's like, I don't really have any neighbors or anything, right? It's really weird. It was really, it was a heavy adjustment for how I was used to living. And it's funny now, this summer, for some reason, there's just snakes like everywhere. I mean, like not even small snakes, like 5-6 feet snakes. And I'll just like walk outside of my house and they're crawling up the side, right? And so this period, this was maybe a month ago, like kept finding these snake skins just hanging off of stuff, right? And so I'm shooting, again, this project, Exodus Home, about these homes and everything. And like there's this old birdhouse on the property, and it was just this snake skin sticking out of it. And I was just like, this is the perfect photograph, right? Because like, what's worse than a snake? Is a snake inside of your house, right? A snake inside your house is like the worst predicament ever. It's like, how do I get this out, right? Which in this like image, and I think how I'm thinking about it is like analogy for like, corrupt things coming into your home, right? Which can be both a metaphor, but it also is very much a real issue and problem if you have snakes that come into your home, especially when they're unwanted, right? So here we have Brett, Jonathan, and Miles, the 3 police officers who murdered Breonna Taylor inside of her home, right? So when we think about, again, these ideas of, when we think about sort of photography and like its ability to use like metaphor or analogy for certain things, we also have to really keep in mind that there are very concrete connections to those analogies that are happening all around us, right? And they enter this woman's home with no warrants, there's no charges, right? And there's no arrests. And this level of violence is not new, right? We talk about the idea of generational trauma and this idea of like the Exodus, right? And the Great Migration. So we think between 1960 and 1970, 6 million African Americans are fleeing the South for violent prosecution, and they're going to the North, Midwest, Western cities for better opportunity to escape the violence which they're experiencing at home, trying to leave for better opportunity. And when I think about this in terms of this project, and maybe just generally, I'm reminded that I look at this picture, for example, and I think that they left Florida and let's say they went to Philadelphia, right? And they move into Philadelphia, and and they try to build their lives there. And then you fast forward all through these years, and you look at these large, metropolitan urban centers within the United States, and you see that they are all centers for violence against Black people, their descendants, right? So they're experiencing this high level of violent prosecution. And so for me, when I'm taking these images, I think about it very much in that sense that I'm in a way leaving the metaphorical Philadelphia, right? And the violence and the things happening there for this other place, the South, right? The Virginia, right? Got this job here, better opportunity, right? A new change, right? And then coming here and seeing that, right, again, that if I look at history in the past, this place was home originally for someone else, and then they had to flee it because of violence. And then I start to see the cycle that happens, right? That continues for certain people that have to deal with oppression, where this idea of home is not really very much centered on place, but it's really very much centered on familia, because the places constantly in different ways eventually bring the violence and the things that you were escaping. So it's always having that sort of distrust of home and being there. What's also kind of interesting for me working on this project is sort of the connection between Farmville, Virginia, and Philadelphia. So W.E.B. Du Bois writes this pinnacle study, The Philadelphia Negro, looking at sort of, the social, political, economic situation of Black people, right, during a certain time. And during the study, he comes out here to Farmville while he's writing The Philadelphia Negro. And he talks about sort of this idea of migration in one way. And he says the economic family in Farmville is the complement of the Negro family in a city like Philadelphia. And these two families are very often part of one family. For married couples going north, often leaving their children in Farmville, and single persons live alone in cities and are counted as families of one. In this way, the continual migration complicates the question of the size of the Negro families. And so for me, it was like, again, one of those moments. Remember I said I wasn't romantic and everything about the ancestors speaking, but it's like one of those moments when I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, like, what are the chances? Like, what are the chances that I end up in this place making this work, when there's like this direct connection between even the ways in which people migrated from this place that I've made my home now, and the home that, was Philadelphia. And when I think, Austin, when we think about like migration, I just said it, right? It's like running or leaving from this violence. But, even when people moved to these new, urban centers, they were still fighting for, their liberation, whether it was political, cultural, social. There was no break once they reached Philadelphia or Chicago. It wasn't like the attitude was always very different than that of the southern places in which they come from. And what's interesting, again, thinking through history and the present moment, what's interesting in these moments are the responses. The responses for these calls of liberation, or what the responses from, I confused myself. What's interesting is the responses that sort of the systems that we have in place, these sort of cultural, social, political systems, have the responses they have to Black people's calls for freedom, right? And I think what happens very often is that while we're proclaiming and calling for liberation and change, there's also this normalcy in like masking Black struggles with the faces of white people to be the heads of those things, right? And so I thought about this in terms of this John Brown. If you don't know John Brown, he led the Harper's Ferry, the whole thing, liberating, using militaristic tactics and everything like that, and was against like enslavement and all that kind of stuff, right? And so in the picture, it's me with the face of John Brown, and I'm standing in front of the house of another John Brown. He's the John Brown, the Brown family in Rhode Island, and he was throughout his entire life was a strong believer in enslavement, and was one of the largest importers of enslaved people from the African continent during the transatlantic slave trade, right? If you don't know, a majority of every enslaved voyage leaving the United States left from Rhode Island. So that place, even though we really think about it as the New Englanders and like the liberal ideology, originally they were really entrenched in the trade of enslavement, right? And so it's funny to think about that, like all three of those, all two of those plus myself intersecting, because it's like we all intersect at the point of brownness, right? But the face of, but they become the face of how we understand it, right? And so, during that period, you often see that, it's the calls of Black people during enslavement for their freedom is always the center, when I think of it, of emancipation and liberation. But you see that white people try to control how that occurs and happens on their terms, right? It's the reason that we had the civil rights movement and all these other things was because the terms of freedom were not actually freedom, right? And so I see that in current talks about, like, you can go back to the issue of thinking about education, right? And looking at systems of education, and you see people are calling for more Black people, more BIPOC people to be in places of power, instead of white people being in places of power and having, for lack of better words, subservient entities who work under them for the guise of freedom, right? And so I think, one of the calls is for the removing of the mask and the stepping away and the removal of having power to control or to create change, but let others be the change that they have. Because we know, if we look through history, right, that Black people have very much done the hard labor of creating the things that we see, for better or worse, right? So, and so thinking about that labor, right? So this picture comes from World War II, and it's like this iconic image, and it's like, God, I know I understand where this image comes from. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, right. So it's this poster that comes out and becomes like this iconic image of, women helping the cause for the war, helping the war efforts, right? And it's this it's painful in one way, because it's like this image and its propagation negates all the other people that work for the liberation of their country. But also, it's kind of like the poster in itself, I always think, is low-hanging fruit, because we always knew that Karen was going to be there to support the war effort, right? Throughout time, we always know that she's going to be there to support the efforts of the patriarchal white supremacist system, right? Willing to fight for it. If we think through history and time, we know that she's also willing to lie for it, right? So I go back to 1955. This image is taken in front of the Bryant's grocery store in Money, Mississippi. So you don't know, in 1955, Emmett Till is lynched after being accused by Carol Bryant of making advances on her while at the Bryant's family grocery store. So, and later on, before her death, she admitted to some of the aspects of that story to be untrue, right? And so you have this moment where we start to see the repercussions of the complacency, of the lies, of those systems all kind of working for one another. I just found this image actually very recently, I think maybe last month. And it's an image. So when Emmett Till, he was kidnapped or taken from his great uncle's home by Carolyn's husband and his half brother or stepbrother. And they took him to a cotton gin where they brutalized him, and they tied the cotton gin fan around his neck. And this is what the cotton gin fan looked like. And if you go out to Money, Mississippi now, you can still go and see the barn, the cotton gin barn, or I guess that's the correct terminology for it, but it's still standing there. And now it's been turned into a museum. And if you go a little bit further, you can go to the river site. And the river site is where you find, they found Emmett Till's body. And if you go there now, it's continuously filled with shotgun holes from people coming to shoot it. I think they've replaced it 3 or 4 times last time I checked. And they're continuously, people are continuously coming back, right? So again, thinking about that idea of generational trauma, like just imagine coming to that space. Like I drove out to Money, Mississippi by myself to go see this sign, and that's what it's like. It's just filled with bullet holes, and it's talking about the brutalization of this young man. And so that generational trauma and also that generational delusion, right, continues to run true to today. And so it has me thinking, and I'm wrapping up here, it has me thinking about, I guess, about like thanks or remembering, or like how we think about all of these things that I'm talking about, all of these, like, you know, this centuries of oppression and so on that are going on out here. And so I made this piece, and it's called The Bruises of Thanks. And I've been thinking a lot about how the struggle for freedom in this country by Black people have often, the only thanks you get is the bruise that's left on your body, the thing that you take away from those interactions. It's the only thanks that the other side ever really gives you. So it's a sign that says, for those who loved, toiled, and strove for thee in other years. And the marking on it, right, the words of the monument for it is the wound. So they're branding marks that I made onto the wood, right? And so often thinking about just the ways in which we're given very little thanks for the ways in which we have labored and toiled and strove to try to create home in a place that very often excludes us from very basic human kindness or needs. And so I find myself now here brooding, stewing over these issues, trying to figure out what's next, right? And this is kind of a weird image for me, and I still trying to figure it out for myself. You know, I think often I come into a situation understanding what I want to make a photograph of, but when it actually becomes a literal, real thing, it kind of takes me a second to digest it. You know, because for me, it's like this is a picture of rest in a way, of like a break from everything. All right. And for me, it's like this idea of stewing. So the picture is called stewing. So it's like I'm over here like brooding over something, which if you haven't been able to tell, I am, right? But also it gets back to that thing of consumption, right? And my body is here. This is in a kitchen of what used to be the kitchen for slave quarters where they used to cook at, right? A bridge version. And it's me there, and my body is within the spaces that they would cook in. And it's like, am I being prepared to be consumed, right? Or am I at rest from those from those that wish to consume me? And I guess that's always the question. I guess that's the question right now as well. So yeah, that is where I am. That's where I leave you exactly at the place that I am, with no tied up bows or well wrapped up soliloquies, just brooding. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite people to either raise their hand in the Zoom room and unmute yourself. I don't want to sort of like have everybody ask questions at once, but it would be great to have a conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to talk.
So does anybody have a question for Jay? There was one question in the chat, and I think it referred to the White Power newspaper. And this person, this Etty asks, why swastika is part of your story, question mark. Mhm.
I think that that was the original place that was that I mean, it was I mean, it's there. Well, first of all, it's not a part of my story, right? But like, oh, yeah, why is it a part of the artwork? And I guess it's just because like I want it to be clear that what I mean by white power, right? So it again has that lineage. It's to the swastika and like, right, like Nazism and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think I don't use it as like in any sense as like a part of my narrative, right? As a part of the narrative of those who want to institute genocide into the world. And so that has to be a part of this piece. I can't like, if I'm going to erase something out of history, I'm not going to erase the things which are central to the ideology that I'm trying to counter, right? I have to like include that in this whole sort of like statement, I guess.
Victoria, you turned your mic on. Do you have a question?
No, sorry, I'm calling from France. I'm
Oh, okay.
very interested in this, and I thank you for your presentation. It was fabulous. My question is, how do we levitate from this particular spot we're at? I just wrote this, and where do we go from here? I'm also an artist and a photojournalist. I'm out in France, and I see opportunity, and yet I also see what has pulled us down to the bottom of the ocean so many times. And there's an intersectionality in all of this, including how we live on this planet, which we haven't regarded with much respect either. So how can we work together to elevate as human beings on this planet with the gift of life that we've been given? And how can I support you? And my family's mixed too, so I have experiences looking like I do, which I have a voice with, because I've had direct experience through people I love. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, and you know, I approach this work in no sense an expert. You know, like, you know, I mean, I understand the sentiment of your question, right? But I don't even I don't approach it like, I don't know. I kind of feel like if I had the better, like all the answers, I probably wouldn't be an artist. Like, I just think there's probably a better usage of all the answers and getting them out than probably the art world is. You know, we can do many things, but you know, there's always this tension between, I think, artwork and activism, right? Because I think that, like, you know, I like to think that in my artwork, I try to put ideas about, you know, more equitable ways of living, but like the artwork actually isn't the physical body moving and doing different things. But the thing that I've been really thinking about a lot of, you know, what we need to do moving forward is, I think people got to start giving up some power, you know, and they got to realize what that means. Like, you can't ask for change and not want to give up the power that you have. And giving up that power may mean that you need to put yourself in some positions of not that level of privilege. You know, I mean, I have often these conversations in academia, and my white colleagues will ask me what they can do to diversify the institution, and I tell them to quit.
Yeah, like Reddit, the head of Reddit.
Yeah. So,
you know, yeah, I'm an artist too. I want to use my voice well. I'm a photojournalist and I do sculpture too. And anyway, thank you. I really enjoyed your work. It was very, very inspiring, and I love the intersectionality and the history involved. And I think it will bring great wake-up calls to a lot of people. Thank you for your excellent work.
Thanks for being here.
Joan unmuted herself, but before I go, I just want to connect everybody to the link, the Instagram link to the Photo Green Book. And I think that encapsulates a little bit of what Jay tried to talk about with giving up power and challenging institutions, and just how to look into that Instagram account and project. Joan?
I just wanted to add that I found this to be absolutely magnificent. And I find this to be a horrendous time. I'm past 80 years old. I was alive when Hiroshima was bombed. I lived through many crises. I had family members who were killed in the Holocaust. It just seems that that we are at a point of relentless pain, and just looking outside at ourselves is so hurtful, and you know, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. Although I must say, I make art every single day. I make nasty political art and I post it all over the place. So that is what we can do as artists. We can scream through our art.
It's true.
Yeah, we can definitely scream, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's part, I mean, that's a part of putting things out into the world, right?
Yes.
But I think, right, now the question is who's listening? Right, it's like the people who are listening, are they all in this room right now? And are these the people who are, did you log into here because you're like, I hate this guy and I don't want to listen to what he has to say, right? Or were you already on board? So like, again, I think that's the thing with the art world, is that people often don't go see art shows that they want to hate. You know what I mean? Like if I go look at a whole listening to shows, I don't go to the ones where I don't like that work, or I don't like what that person's saying. And so I'm sure that on the other end, there are people who probably look at my work and say the same thing. And so, right. And again, it's based off of that idea that like, yeah, I can scream and tell people about the positionality or the ideology of you know, more equitable living, or talk about the experiences of being oppressed or Black within the system, right? But if I'm only telling it to the circle within the art realm, is that going to do it, right? And then of course, I mean, I'm sure that can open up to like, well, why just make work inside the white box and putting stuff out in the open world? But I think, again, there's another conversation that can be had about that as well.
I have two questions. One is related to your history, and then the other one is related to your art practice. Where did you go to high school in Philadelphia?
I was homeschooled. My
You were
parents,
homeschooled.
yeah, they wouldn't let me go to the man's schools.
Okay, so your parents made this decision.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. I work with a lot of Philadelphia high school students, so I was just curious.
Yeah.
And then my real question is, I was just looking at your website, and I noticed that well, because while you're presenting, I realize you're presenting the image and maybe not so much like what the final idea of the image looks like. So I was in my head that is like, would he want to do video or books, or like what does it look like? But it looks like you've done a lot of really cool sculptural and installation kind of work. So I think that's just what I wanted to know, like, how do you envision your work being seen? And then maybe thinking about the last question too, like, are there spaces where you wish you could show your work that are perhaps unconventional, so the people that that we were talking about that might not be tuning into this right now or don't care could actually see it?
Yeah. So with a lot of my photo work, I'm just going to share my screen with you guys again, so other people can see what you're looking at. So a lot of my work, I don't really use like frame it necessarily. I kind of make a lot of it, like even just the photographs, kind of sculptural. And then, yeah, I kind of been playing around a lot with using more like physical objects in different ways. And I think that for me, it's like just my general frustration with photography, that like, I love it. I mean, I really do. I really love it, but God, it's just like, it's so removed from reality. You know what I mean? It's like you take it and take your little frame. Already you're boxing out like the majority of the world, and then you're taking it and then you're framing it in this little thing and you're putting it up there and like, look at the world. And it's like, but where is it at? Right? So for me, a lot of the sculptures that I make are a lot about like found objects, are making things to kind of like fit a time period. And when I show the work, it's very much about trying to create like an atmosphere or feeling. So really kind of taking the things that were within the images and either framing the images or trying to create some type of like tension there. I kind of do that in most of the projects. I think there's some pictures up here. We'll see if it loads. What was your second question? I'm sorry, or the second part? I forgot.
It was all that. It's all this.
Oh, okay.
I think it was like if there's certain spaces where you'd want to show your work, like I know
yes.
conversation,
So,
like the white walls versus like a park.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. The short of it is that I used to do it a whole lot more. And I varying degrees of getting in trouble for it. And I think some other things associated with making work that way that left bad feelings in my mouth have like just recently made me not do it. But I think that there's like total value in it too. You know what I mean? Like I see people who have workout in that fashion. I'm like, that totally makes sense. But I think there's just like a totally uniquely me experience that has like recently I haven't been doing a lot of that. But I think that like, I think a well-rounded practice needs to include things which are not directly within sort of like the artistic realm. And I think for me, like recently that has been sort of doing the things with the photo green book. Is sort of like my outside posting. So I know, or you put up the link, but I just go to just a real quick and talk about it because I know I have a couple of minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, you do.
Okay. So the photo green book, I started back in May, and the idea originally was to kind of model it after the original photo, or not photo green book, but the original green book. It's not going to let me click, which was the Negro Motorist green book, which was during like 1930s to I think like mid 1960s. It was originally printed, and it was a series of listings for safe places for African Americans who were traveling through the segregated America, right? And so it was like places they could eat, they could lodge. And so I thought about that in terms of photography and trying to create a listing of organizations and spaces that could be places that could support their creativity, and also they could be able to see reflections of themselves within it. I'm basically looking at it around this idea of inclusion, diversity, equity, and advocacy. And it started from there, and it moved to creating a list of questions. So the list for those considering diversity when complacency wasn't enough. And it's a list of questions that can be used by institutions or individuals to question and think about equity, inclusion, and diversity. And all these things are crowdsourced. So we put up calls and ask for people to submit questions or submit suggestions. And just recently, we have the Green Pages, which was started by Sydney Ellison. She's over at Pratt. And she contacted me to ask if she could create a reading list. And so it's a reading list and some podcasts that look at the questions of diversity, equity, inclusion within photography, somewhat the visual arts in general. And she's been really great at helping sort of organize and put together a lot of the things that the Green Book has going on now. And more recently, right now, we're, and if this is an open call, that's why I'm so glad that this is getting brought up. Open action call for everyone else out there as well. Right now, we are collecting and bringing together the calls for equity, inclusion, and diversity from academic institutions. That's where the RISD one came from earlier. And we're kind of posting them now so we can look at them. But our hope is to gather enough of them so that we can create some sort of like chart or like look at what is the baseline for the calls and what people are looking for. So what is an equitable, diverse, inclusive university or place look like, and how are we imagining that so that as other people go to do these things, that they have the resources. And I think that that's really what this thing has kind of morphed into, is like really being able to do some of the work of the legwork, right? So like, often we're in meetings and talking to people as African-American. I know this through a lot of my other colleagues, of having to bring up questions and topics to engage with our other faculty or just the university at large. And so you can have a list of questions that you can send someone to instead of doing that labor yourself, right? And so this is also thinking about it in that same terminology.
Thank you. Because we want to respect your time, Ben, I see you have a question. I'm so sorry we won't be able to get to it, but because I really want to end within an hour. But I hope everybody can go to the Green Book, the photographer's Green Book. I think it's useful beyond the photography medium. Certainly the questions are really important and very challenging for any cultural organization and the world. So thank you, Jay, for bringing this into existence and for all your work on that as well. Thanks again for your presentation. So much to appreciate and feel grateful for. So with that, I would like to say goodnight to everybody. And I really appreciate everybody coming in, and I'm sorry about the wrong password. We'll be careful next time.
Good night.